Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone, or afternoon or evening, depending on where you're located. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to our Connect Keynote webinar featuring Jeremy Solomons and Rita Wuebbeler. This is Patty Ainsworth from CoachSource, and I will be facilitating today's first session of Coaching Across Cultures, Helping Leaders Lead Across Difference. Before we get started, please be sure, if you're not already muted, to mute yourselves so we can avoid any background noise, since we have quite a few people attending this morning's sessions here in California. It's morning for us. Since we don't have any polls this morning, we will be asking you to answer any poll type questions in the chat box. So please be sure your messages are set to everyone so we can all see your responses. Also, if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please write them in the question box, and we will try to answer as many questions, if not all, as they come in. And I also, if you can see my screen here, I also wanted to share with you our upcoming keynotes and conversations on our Connect website. This morning, as you'll see, we have the keynote webinar with Jeremy and Rita, and our next Connect conversation is with Patty Beach, and that is on November 8th. I'd like to also direct you to using connections here, and if you click on that in the Connect website and you click on calendar, you'll see the remaining keynote webinars and conversations that are coming up. And you'll also see our next webinar is with Brian Underhill, and that is on November 16th. And he's going to be sharing the results of the latest 2017 coaching survey. So if you haven't registered for that, please do so by clicking the links down here. And I think that's pretty much sums it up. And without further ado, I'm now going to turn over the screen to Jeremy and Rita to introduce themselves and start our webinar.
Hello there, this is Jeremy Solomons, and again, welcome to everybody. Just wanted to emphasize that I know we're all busy, but we promise if we make a deal that we have you done by the end of the hour, that the last one, stay focused, maximize the webinar and full screen, so that we can get through everything. We want to make this as interactive as we possibly can with nearly 30 people, and more will probably be joining us. So there we go. Welcome to everyone, and can we just try out the chat function, and wherever you are in the world or whatever language you speak, would you like to share welcome in your language, or good evening, good morning, just to see that with the chat functions working well. So, and please, again, as Patty said, send it to everybody. Hopefully you've located the chat function on the control panel. And again, just send it to everyone. Oh, why is it going out of? It keeps on going out of main screen. Anyway, maybe not. All right, we're going to move on as we have a lot for the hour, so we'll have to try it again in a little while. A little bit about me. That person top left is not me in the 70s, but was my hero. Again, if anyone can use the chat function, and if you know who he is, or sadly was, he was my hero growing up in Manchester. It was George Best, who was the Leo Messi of the day. That's where I grew up, and I've had the chance to live and work in 8 different countries around the world, and work in about 40 more countries. Top right is I had a life as a banker, as a commercial banker, a private banker, development banker with the World Bank. I also worked as a foreign correspondent for Reuters news agency in 3 continents. So I've had a very varied background, like many coaches, done a lot of different things, and been an independent consultant coach for the last 25 years. And actually, I'm normally based in Austin, Texas, but today I'm actually in Georgia. I'm in Atlanta this morning, and when we do the webinar this evening, I'll be in Rome, Georgia, not Italy. And that's a photo of me more recently. And now I'll pass over to my colleague, Rita.
Guten Morgen aus Atlanta. Hier ist Rita Wuebbeler. Ich komme aus Goldenstedt in Norddeutschland und lebe jetzt in Atlanta. Und wie Sie sehen können, habe ich meine 2 Pässe dort aufgelistet. Oops, you thought you were in the wrong place, right? Good morning again. This is Rita Wuebbeler. Didn't want to scare you off, but just to kind of expose you to what we all come across sometimes when we do intercultural work across cultures. So thanks for being on this webinar with us. And Jeremy and I are very delighted to do this together from my office here in Atlanta. As I was saying, I'm from a small town in northern Germany. I have lived in the US for over 30 years, hold 2 passports, which is a great privilege, and have made crossing cultures my life's work in different contexts, mostly in coaching, but also in team building and leadership development work. And just like Jeremy, I'm also a big soccer fan. We have a new team here that's very successful in the playoffs now, Atlanta United. And my final thing is that I'm a new cyclist. I cycle a lot, about 1,000 miles a year, and raise money for AIDS vaccine research doing it. And why is this topic important? You've obviously gotten up early, some of you, because you're interested in this. It's of growing importance in this global business world, and many of our clients, whether we know it or not, are from different cultural backgrounds. And sometimes you think, well, speaking their language is enough, and especially if we speak the global language of English. But that's not it. That's not all of it. The language will give us the window on the culture or the background of somebody, but there's a lot more to be aware of. And so we're putting this iceberg image here, which many of you have seen. The tip is obvious, behaviors, but the underlying motivations for these behaviors are not. And so in coaching, this is especially important, and we'll tell you why in a little bit. So we want to know where you are in the world. If the chat function works now, would you just sort of write down your city? And I'm going to do this by time zone. Anybody in the Western time zone, Pacific time zone, PST, where are you from? Maybe only Patty got up early in San Francisco, but maybe the chat function doesn't work at this moment so well.
Rita, they're actually coming through on the question box. So
okay, let me go there. Okay, let me see. That's which I probably can't see because. Can you see it, Patty?
Yes, I can see it. We have Olwen Merritt from London is actually on the line.
Yep.
We have let's see, Pascal Mazuka from Brussels, Belgium. We have Kelly Holm in Seattle. Luis Velasquez in Redwood City, California. For some reason,
okay, great.
Working. So just the question box. So we're going to go ahead and keep using that.
Yeah.
We have Pam Fox Rollin. She's from Sunnyvale. We have Linda Ladden from Lower Normandy. Michael Papanik is here from San Francisco, and Linda Ladden from France. We have Elizabeth Okada from India. Lisa from Felice from San Francisco. Henry Lee is here from Canterbury in Kent in the United Kingdom. Let's see, Portland, Oregon, I believe, with Dave Underhill. We have Cape Town with Michael Leon, South Africa, Edith Sievers, Estonia, it's Ivar Luck, Portugal, Alexandra Pereira. Let's see. Let's go through these very quickly. We have Bangalore, India, and we have another India. So we've got quite a few people from around the world here.
I'm very excited. Thank you, Patty, for reading those off to us. Very excited to have all of you on the call. So my next question is maybe a little bit superfluous, but we're going to ask it anyway. What is your practice in coaching? Who do you currently coach people from another country? That's the first question. So just put yes in, or we'll assume that you are doing it. And then the second question is, do you currently coach people who are different from you? And you might be rolling your eyes, of course. This is a bit of a cheeky question, wanting to point out that there's different kinds of differences that we're talking about today. And so we want to address the first question, different cultures, and we're going to explain what we mean by that in a minute. But also recognizing that whoever we're engaging with is going to be different from us. Apples and oranges. So our agenda for today, we're going to do some definitions, going over what we mean by culture and how we're going to break that down. We're going to also, of course, spend a lot of time on the implications for our coaching practice if we are coaching people from different cultures, different cultural backgrounds. And then we're also going to share some tips and reminders and things to be aware of when we do coach across cultures. And I'm going to turn it back over to Jeremy for the first part on definitions.
So there's lots of different ways to define culture, and depending on your background, if any of you are anthropologists, by training, you probably have a very specific way. What we look at it is from a behavioral point of view, which we think is most appropriate in a coaching context. So, what affects the way people think and behave? And so we've created, there's lots of different models, there's circles, there's onions. We've created a pyramid, and it's based on different research. Uri Bronfenbrenner is more of a social psychologist. Don Schwartz and Rowe are more in the diversity field. Edgar Schein, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, in the organizational development field. So trying to come up with, again, what it is that influences people. And very briefly, going from the top of the pyramid down in terms of likely differentiation. So we asked earlier just now about difference. So what makes people different? And typically universal things, going back to Maslow's hierarchy, all of us need to eat and sleep and procreate and defecate and various other bodily functions. And mostly in the case, that's not something that differentiates us. Those are things we have in common, and not a big thing to differentiate us. Although, having worked a lot myself with immigrants and refugees, that's not always the case. Looking at Puerto Rico and other places right now, clearly that brings this universal element into play when you're basically fighting for survival. But mostly that's not a big issue. Geographical, which we're going to spend some time on, because it is a big issue immediately when you think about coaching across cultures, and we just asked you how many are working with people in other countries. It is important, and we have people from, I think, around about 8 or 10 countries here. So it is important. Main caveat we want to make right from the beginning is around stereotypes, that not to assume because somebody's from Japan, they're very indirect, or because contrast somebody's from Netherlands, that they're very direct. That's the main thing with geographical. It can be an indication. It can also lead us in wrong direction. So we're going to look at that in a bit more detail in a while. Organizational culture, obviously. So a UPS, for example, is very different from a GEC or a Hitachi. So that's something that will influence behavior. And you can always ask the question, well, did you choose, or our coachees choose the organization? Did they choose them? And then very often, many of us are working at medium to senior levels, our coachees. So how much do they embody the organization they work for? So a company with very strong values and identities, such as a Novartis or a J&J, how much then do people become part of the organization? And particularly as they get to higher decision-making levels where they can influence the culture of the organization, then it becomes a much more interesting question. Professional culture linked to that. Many of us are coaching people in different fields. They may be in finance, in legal, PR, operations. So that clearly is a big influence on people in terms of how they view the world, how they think and behave. Then getting a bit more personal, and this is where anthropologists sometimes can raise flags and say, hey, we're getting too individual here. And again, we're looking at it from a behavioral point of view, as many of us are coaching individuals. So we need to look at the individuals we're working with, not just their influences. And obviously community could be their first community in terms of where they grew up, urban versus rural, big family, small family, religious community, secular community, all different kinds of things. That would include schooling, other activities. So we're now getting a bit more personal. And then the second community, where are they living now? Or maybe third or fourth, for people that have been very mobile, where are they now? Why do they live in Cape Town or in London or in Delhi? What is it that brought them to that community, and how does it influence, again, the way they think and behave? Maybe they've moved permanently, maybe they're on a 3-year expatriate assignment. So clearly that will influence them. And then the last 3 are very individual things, which are not easy to find out immediately, but can be very important in terms of understanding who we're working with. So flexible culture, and there's many ways of slicing and dicing this, but we choose to do it in terms of flexible culture, things that can be changed. So for example, things like education, religion. People may have been born into a certain religion, yet chosen their own path as they became an adult. Also, this gets into sometimes uncomfortable areas, for example, gender, in terms of gender expression versus gender identity. And this we could have a whole conversation about. So in terms of flexible is how people express themselves in terms of their gender, versus fixed culture would be their identity as a man, as a woman, whether that is in line with their birth certificate or not. And obviously big debate here in the US and to a certain extent in other countries around the world. So that's where we're looking at fixed culture versus flexible. Fixed would include things like sexual orientation, would include things like age. We may lie about our age, but we all know how old we are. Even birth order, that sometimes can have an influence. There's research being done into that around birth order and leadership, although some of it can be misleading. So these, again, just some of the things to think about when we think about diversity, individual diversity. This is where it would come up in terms of flexible and fixed. And then the last one is just purely personal. These things, we have unique traits in terms of our character or personality. And if any of you are twins or triplets or no, people that are, many people say that even though people are twins, identical twins, they may have very different personalities. So that's about as personal, as individual as you can get. So using that model, we start to think about culture in a different way, in a much more holistic, expansive way. And that's where we, again, geographical is important, but other things, particularly individual culture, becomes more important, and in line with, again, ICF and other guidelines around understanding not just what our coaches are doing, but who they are as people. And by getting to know this kind of thing in an appropriate way, clearly, we can start to understand that difference between us and the other person. And the place to start when we're talking about difference is going to be our own difference. So these are a few questions. If you've not done this kind of work before, this is based on the avatar work of Harry Palmer. These are just some questions you could ask yourself in terms of your difference when you're thinking about who you are and what your individual culture is, what your individual pyramid, using too many models, your individual pyramid looks like. So what influenced you? What were you taught to believe? Again, in that first community, that first culture that you were part of when you were growing up. And what are your values now, which may be in line, may not be in line with what you were taught when you were a kid, teenager. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that right now. Just want to leave that with you in terms of thinking about where you are and what your culture is before you start to think about what your coachee's culture might be. Let me just pause before I pass back to Rita. And in terms of the pyramid and the individual culture, are there any immediate questions? Again, Paddy, I can't see any, but have you received any questions so far in terms of what we've just gone through on these 2 slides?
No, I don't see any questions as of yet, but I'm sure now that you've invited, maybe some will come through.
Okay. Just while we're waiting for any questions, there's a quote from the former Fed chairman, Alan Greenspan, who said, if you've understood everything that I said, then clearly I wasn't clear enough. So hopefully we will get some questions. And if there's no immediate ones, then I'm going to pass back to Rita. And obviously we can come back to any of your questions later.
Okay.
Rita?
Yes. So from a British to a German accent again. Now looking at the second rung in that pyramid from the top again that Jeremy talked about, geographical culture, sometimes you might see the term national culture, and We prefer geographical because national is just simply too limiting. Because even thinking about the US regions, you know, somebody from California might have a very different cultural background than somebody from the South. And that's probably true for most countries in the world. So, and if you look at culture, what comes up immediately and what's important to us as coaches is, you know, what are the values that are held in a certain cultural group? And so there have been all sorts of models been thought of and conceived of to try to classify values. And in the mid-1990s, this Institute for Global Ethics run by Rush Kidder on the West Coast, I believe it was, came up with this survey to see whether there were any, you know, globally held moral shared values. And you see those on the right. And if I could ask you now to, but I can't because the chat is not working, but just sort of a rhetorical question, do you think that these are all globally shared? And some might argue, well, yes, I can see how some of these are, but really for our work, it's not so helpful to think of them this way, because even if we look at something as universal as freedom, what does that really mean, right? Or reverence for life, or tolerance. There's many different definitions. And so while it is somewhat helpful in certain contexts to look at these as a globally held values, for our work, that's probably not as helpful. But you can always have a discussion about this.
Rita?
Or challenge us on this. Yes, Patty.
We do have a couple of questions that have come through.
Okay.
I'd like to read some of them off.
Yeah.
From Martine, she is asking, the form of the pyramid, what does it mean in respect of the relation between the layers? I assume it is not level.
No, it's just you know, sort of for the sake, it's somewhat contrived in that sense. The point is, this is just, you know, sort of to present the pyramid, and then that first question afterwards is really gets at, so what does your pyramid look like? So for some people, the organizational is going to be much more, if you're, say, running your own company, then the organization is going to be very strong because the company is you, the startup is you. So I'm thinking, you know, Michael Dell, for example, you know, very much part of that organization. He went away, came back. So that would be a bigger piece. For somebody who is, you know, sort of working with some personal issues, then the flexible or fixed may come in. So everybody's is different. This is just a way of presenting it.
Okay. And then we do have a comment from Lillian Abrams regarding regional cultures. She says, people certainly don't think about this or get it about the U.S. or about India or other countries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very true. We often overlook this. And especially in this field of intercultural communication, where we, you know, we're easy to kind of, like Jeremy was saying, the word stereotype, easy to come up with certain characteristics or almost like normative values for certain cultures. But we need to be very, very careful to only use those as perhaps directional aids or help, and really look at the person in front of us as an individual and let the rest sort of disappear into the background.
Okay.
So one way of doing this, I hope that answers the question, Lillian. Thank you for your question. So one way of doing this is to have this next model, if we can use one more here, in mind, which lets us look at values in a different way in terms of a continuum, saying that we all fall somewhere on these continua, and there's many different ways of looking at values, but these are the ones that we often use, those 5 values sort of pairs, you could say. But saying that people have preferences, for instance, on the first one, to be looking at time as a organizing tool for their life, basically, and for them time, punctuality is very important, whereas other people are more towards the right, and for them relationship building goes, you know, comes before being on time. So being late for a meeting because somebody else asked you for help is not as, you know, as serious. So what are people's preferences on these values continua to have an idea might be very helpful for your coaching them. And traditionally, there's an assumption that the US is sort of on the left-ish, right? but that's just, again, can be a stereotype because there might be in Americans who are not as punctual and of course not as individualistically oriented. So it's mixing and matching. So these are helpful tendencies or trends, but really look at the individual in front of you. Where does this person fall? In coaching, what I have found in my work, they're all important, but the second one is, to me, is a good starting point. Often somebody from an individualistic culture or from a group culture, and what has that play out in their specific case. I was coaching somebody from South Korea who's lived in the US for about 10 years, for over a year, and while he was very individualistic in some ways, and I think that was his personality and somewhat of his cultural background, he certainly sometimes came back to his group preference for sure when it came to looking at his team and looking at the whole organization. And so I had to keep that in mind. And so you can use this as a tool to sort of gauge where your clients might be, and then, what does that mean for coaching them? If there's any questions on these two slides, please feel free to raise them, or more comments, Jeremy, from you.
Rita, we do have a question.
Yep.
At which level in the pyramid are these values? Personal?
At which level in the pyramid are these values?
Mm-hmm. Is it in the personal section? I think is.
Oh, sorry. So these would be in the upper levels, but again, since we are asking you to look at each person individually on a case-by-case study, but this would help give you an overview, sort of in the tip of the pyramid, where it says geographical. But that's sort of where they would be placed, if that's helpful.
Okay, we have another question from Pascal is asking, does this mean that when you're in the office, it's organizational culture that trumps, when at home, national culture that trumps? Is this correct?
An interesting question, Pascal. I wouldn't say that's always correct. It can be sometimes correct. Again, it depends on the personality. I know many of my clients take their quote-unquote Germanness with them to work, and so they're both equally important. And depending on what you're working on, what position you might have in the organization, again, I think, like Jeremy's saying, if you're an entrepreneur, work might become a very important part of your identity. And if you're the CEO of an organization, that might become a very important part of your identity. But I know a lot of CEOs also who have a very distinct personal style or personal focus that they bring to work. So it's kind of hard to say what trumps what. It just depends on the person and the context.
If I can give an example, I was working for the Mexican subsidiary of a German multinational, and we did an exercise similar to this around values. And traditionally, the Mexican culture would be traditionally more to the right considered. That's what research would show. And what was interesting is that these, they were fairly young, they're late 20s, early 30s, in junior to middle management. And what was interesting was that they didn't really conform to traditional Mexican culture, but they didn't conform to German culture either, which might be similar in certain areas, different in others. Directness, for example, is, traditionally that's seen as a German trait. And what they conformed to far more was the culture of this multinational, which, even though it was German-based, because it had operations around the world, and that, if you think about it, makes sense that if you're coaching someone that's working for a multinational in another country, so for example, in India or China or other places, then think about it, they've made a conscious choice to say, I want to have a different experience. I don't want to work for a typical company from my culture. I want to work for a global company because of the opportunities it might provide career-wise, etc. So they are already what might be called, not facetiously, cultural deviants. They don't represent their geographical culture, they represent something sometimes of a hybrid, which may be partly individual related, maybe partly related to their experience of perhaps they studied, they did a master's or a PhD in another country. So that's where, again, the idea of getting beyond the stereotypes, to use this as a guide, as Rita said, and always think about, okay, what is the biggest influence? So it can be organizational, it can be other things as well.
Do we have time for one more question?
Of course, yeah, please.
Okay. This one is from Dave Underhill. He says, in my experience, many of these models come from developed US, European cultures. What is your experience with how other less developed cultures view this issue? What models, if any, do they use to explain cultural differences?
Well, I would not, with all due respect, Dave, maybe use the word more developed or less developed cultures. I think that this model would suit any kind of culture. Maybe you're thinking of some African cultures that have a different kind of structure or so. But I think you can apply it to, in my mind, in my experience, you can apply it as a guide to any cultural background here. I don't know what you would think, Jeremy.
Yeah, I mean, for example, I used it. I was doing some lecturing in Rwanda last year in Kigali in a private school for women, and we used this model with the students, with the staff, and they were perfectly comfortable with it, and we had some fascinating discussions around it. They didn't see it necessarily as a Western model. They just saw it as an interesting way of viewing culture, and again, that link between geographical culture, organizational culture, in this case, an academic institution, and individual culture, and helping them, as many of them hopefully going into management when they graduated, they really were interested in this idea behind, for example, individual and group. I remember we had a very good discussion about that, and around, and this we find with coachees around the world is, most of them are leading at least one team, if not many teams. And then when you think about things like recognition, do you do it on an individual basis? Do you do it on a group basis? So those kind of issues will come up. And my experience, I've probably used this or a version of this, probably 20, 30 different countries. And it's not really come up as this is Western. Bob Coles was actually from the Bay Area, some of you may know. But he did spend, interesting, a lot of time in Korea. And that's where the formulation of this first came, as he, like many of you, might have had the chance to live in another culture and then view your own original culture. And that's the genesis of this Wallace continuum. If you're interested, there's actually 13 continua. We've just chosen 5.
I want to say 2 more things to this question, Dave and others. People don't usually argue with the content of this model, but what they might argue with, depending on their cultural background, is that the model itself. Like, what kind of models do you choose? Where does this model come from? When I think of my German clients, that's what I often get with, but how can you prove this? So that's one thing. And then the second thing is, where it also comes in is, how are you seen in this culture as a coach? What is, often in hierarchical cultures that tend traditionally to be more hierarchical, a coach might be seen in the category of a teacher. In Japanese, you would call them sensei. And so you tend not to question the teacher as much as you would just like a colleague. So thinking about those things, what am I bringing with me in this culture, into this person's cultural background as a coach, in terms of my positional quote unquote power? That might be interesting. But the content itself, I think, is, like Jeremy said, pretty it's usable across cultures. Which is a good.
Any other questions? Oh, sorry.
That's a good segue to the next, our next sort of main piece of looking at implications from the coaching perspective. But yes, if there are other questions, by all means.
Yeah, we have several of them. I don't know that we can get to all of them, but
maybe one more. Yeah.
Okay, we'll go with Donna Conforti. She's asking, do you assess your client in some way to determine which cultural aspects are dominant That is, do they mostly affiliate with country of origin or organization or something else?
That's a great question, and this could take another webinar to answer that. Because there's a lot of instruments out there. There's those that measure people's preferences along those continua lines that we have here on this slide, and then they put it against the national cultural tendencies or culture of choice, either their own or another culture that they're interested in. And there's also assessments that measure your cultural, what we call sensitivity or developmental stage. The most prominent that I know is called the Intercultural Developmental Inventory, IDIassessment.org, if you wanted to look that up, which measures somebody's view of differences in general. So you can message us or email us privately. We have information on all these assessments that we can share with you.
And then
so let's
just
talk about
using can I just add something, Rita? Just also, what you probably do with, any coach that you have some kind of intake. And what I'm always very interested to just know about the person's background. I'll usually go on LinkedIn just to check, sort of how long they've been in that organization. Are they a company person that's been there 20 years? Have they just joined from arrival? So that can give you a bit of an indication, again, about how institutionalized they might be or not. And then certainly, most of us do some form of manual or assessment for 360. And I find, that I can get a lot of information there in terms of looking at that of, I'm just working with someone right now who was just promoted above about 6 of his colleagues. So the competition thing comes, competition versus cooperation. He's a very cooperative person, but he's also very competitive. And people view him as being both. So he's kind of somewhere in the between. So I kind of get my own gauge of, from that, sometimes impartial, objective points of view, and also obviously just from my interactions with that new coachee to be able to sort of get a gauge of where they are, time, relationship, etc. So it's a mixture of subjective, objective. But I do find it helps to create your own profile.
Yeah, so we're going to, yes, Patty?
Oh, no, I wasn't speaking.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. We're going to move now into the, more specific or some more examples of implications for coaching. And Jeremy, will you take this?
Yeah. So what we thought was, many of you are ICF certified. And so what we thought was might be helpful is, okay, let's go back to basics in a way and think about, we've got this definition from ICF, which all of us have memorized and embodied in our work, and just thinking now that we've started to throw out some things, looking at the pyramid, looking at the values continuum, etc., does it start to make you see things in a different light? So we've basically bolded the whole definition because each of these words, when you start to play around with it from a cultural perspective, whether it's geographical culture, organizational culture, individual culture, you start to see, okay, maybe this is not what I thought it was. It takes us out of our comfort zone to really think about, what does that really mean and how might that be interpreted by my coachee? And obviously we're not just thinking about the coachee, but also who are his boss, sponsors, stakeholders within the organization. So just wondering, on this, and again, our chat function, we can't view the chat. So we were planning to use that. So Patty, we may have to rely on you. So basically on this, if you just share with us your thoughts on this, on how does this change your point of view in terms of you being an effective coach? What does it mean to maximize potential? What does it mean to engage in a thought-provoking and creative process? Even who is your client? If you're thinking about individual versus group, who is the group? Is it the client's team? Again, is it their client sponsors, their organization? Even, if you're working, let's say, with nonprofit, community, society at large. So we're throwing out some questions, and we wanted to use the rest of our time to really provoke you into seeing things, using this definition as a launching pad to see things in a different way. So Patty, if you can help us with this, so please write down your thoughts. If anyone actually wants to come online, I think we do have the capacity to unmute you if there's something you want to say that you prefer not to write, you want to just say. So let's use this time to have more of an open dialogue in terms of the implications of culture on your effective coaching practice.
We'll wait for some to come in. The last one we had come in while we're waiting for others was Pam Fox-Rollin. She said she's meeting with an American executive today whose leadership is challenged by managing many people from India and Ukraine together on teams, and she would be glad for any insights you might have.
Well, so this person, yeah, that's a interesting question, Donna. Again, I would go to the values continuum in this case. I would also, of course, do some research online. One of our best practices, of course, has to do with preparation. There's so many resources out there. What are the basic values, traditional values that are held by Ukrainians and Indians? Although, again, India is very complex these days because we have the sort of old style India and then the high-tech India, and so the values don't always correspond to one another. But get some ideas there. Talk to an Indian person. But since you're doing this afternoon, I would really just look at where might the biggest gaps be. And for Indian culture, in my experience, working with Western leaders, US leaders specifically, it's the individual and group dimension as well as the equality and hierarchy dimension, which then translates into people seemingly being more indirect than direct in their communication style. But that often goes back to the one above about hierarchy and equality. The reluctance to express an opinion or go into a conflict because you don't question your boss, kind of thing. So that's some very basic tendencies that I would use here. But again, I would do research and just try to, work around that. And for Ukraine, again, that's not Russia necessarily. It's related, of course. But again, look up what you can find about Ukrainian culture. And just let the person speak for themselves too and see what his experience has been, but then try to sort of broaden their minds by explaining some of these things to him, perhaps the values continuum. You could even bring that in so that they don't go to stereotypical things that they might have picked up or know about their colleagues or their reports from Ukraine or India. It's really about widening their perspective, I think, in this case, your job, coaching an American leader.
And the other thing, I believe we have some people on the call from India, so
yeah.
It would be very interesting to hear or see if you have any basic advice, from your experience of coaching in India, anything that you would share from your own experience. We're talking about partnering with clients. Well, let's partner with our colleagues and peers here on the call. So do you have anything to share, any of you? If not personally, any useful resources, articles that you would feel would be helpful in this situation?
And if you have any questions at this point, since they're opening it up, I think it's safe to go ahead and raise your hand. You'll see a little hand button, and I can go ahead and unmute you, and you can feel free to jump in there and ask questions directly. I have a couple of other questions. I don't see any hands raised at the moment. But what we can do is I've got more questions here.
Okay.
And Jerry Lou Johnson, I believe she's in Mexico. And she says that hierarchy is highly respected in Latin American cultures, which often implies the LA client looks up, the Latin American client looks up to the coach for direct guidance rather than partnering, which is obviously, impacts that relationship.
Certainly, and again, we don't want to stereotype, but again, knowing that framework and then seeing how that person again is typical of that culture or not, and so clearly, that's where we can use this as a guideline that this may be the case. But then again, it might be a foreign organization they work for in Mexico or another Latin American country, And so it may not be typical of that culture. In fact, that's why the person chose to work for them, because they didn't want to work in a hierarchical environment. And can I just say, Jerry Lou, I'm very glad to hear you're okay. So, personal note. See you soon.
Let's see. We have a comment here from Henry Lee. And it says, I start with where the coachee is and what any data means to them, whether it is a 360 assessment or a self-reporting profiling tool, etc. In terms of the value continuum, people explain what their values means to them, and we use them as a foundation. The biggest challenge is when I coach in English and the coachee does not have English as a first language. They sound English, but their use of the words and their comprehension or use of jargon may be different. Sometimes we have to dig much deeper to see what they actually mean. It's easier, for example, to coach a French person in French.
Yeah, that's such a good comment, and we haven't even really touched upon the whole issue of language and what kind of potential barriers that can build or form. And it really is difficult for somebody who grew up in a monolingual environment to actually put themselves into the shoes of somebody else who is now speaking English as a second or even third or fourth language. So if you as a coach can just propel yourself back into your last vacation, if you took one, to a foreign country where you didn't speak the language, and just sort of feel what that was like, and how helpless you perhaps felt, and just to develop some more empathy for this client. And I spend a lot of time sometimes with clients from other cultures talking about language and the impact of their communication style on their effectiveness as leaders or managers in this U.S. environment. So just showing empathy is often very helpful, and then showing them resources, and really being very specific to them, which kind of goes, and I say this, it's not really coaching, but I share feedback that I have on language with them sometimes, and they're very, very grateful for that. This helps their efficiency and their I think competence in their jobs. But I also make clear that that's not really coaching. So I take a little bit of time out and use a few minutes to point out some language things. But that's a really big topic that gets not enough attention in my mind, and when we talk about coaching cross cultures.
Just a couple of things on the 360 assessment, that sometimes when you're working globally, you'll have someone in the comments section, which we all love to look at, who will respond in another language that we don't speak, like German or Chinese or whatever. So that can be a practical problem sometimes, that you just can't understand the input you're getting. And then also there's another element that if you are working with people in an organization or country where there is a strong hierarchy, sometimes the quality of that 360 feedback may be a little bit too good, where people don't feel comfortable saying anything that might be perceived as being negative about their boss or even a peer. And so, again, without stereotyping, but that can sometimes come in as well, which can come in, again, within your own culture. But sometimes that's where that may play out. So that's where, if you have the chance to supplement written data with other forms of data interviews, you can do one-on-one, where people might be more confident about confidentiality if it's a one-on-one conversation by phone or face-to-face versus something written where there's a feeling, well, I don't want to write anything down that might be perceived as causing someone to lose face. So these are things which, again, without stereotyping, are to be aware of in your assessment that may be culturally impacted.
We do have our first hand raised, so if I can go ahead and unmute Steve, I'll let him go ahead and ask his question or present his comment. Go ahead, Steve. Are you there? Or maybe not. What happened to Steve?
You scared him off, Patty.
I did. I think I did. He looks like he's self-muted. So,
okay.
Steve, if you're on mute and you can hear me, go ahead and unmute yourself. Nope, looks like he's muting himself again. Let me unmute. I'm trying to oh, nope, he keeps disappearing. Okay. Should we move on to another question, or?
Yes.
Yeah, we've got a few more minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would like to make another point regarding our definition here as well.
Okay.
But let's do a question first.
Okay. This one's from Martine, and it was asked a little while ago. She said, do you often use this continuum as a media for discussion among cultures? Another idea to use this model as a tool? I'm not exactly sure.
Well, I think, that's what I do. I use this in the coaching conversation actually to sometimes when it's relevant for the client, especially with somebody from another culture, to perhaps understand, let him or her understand their colleagues or bosses or reports better. It's one way of getting somebody to reflect about their values, which is a very important piece of development, I think, for anybody, but especially if you're in a leadership capacity. So yes, I would certainly take that into the coaching conversation.
Okay. And we've got Steve is unmuted now. If we could go ahead and let him speak. Is that okay?
Yep.
Hi, Patty, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yep.
All right, great. Well, thank you for this presentation. I find there's a bit of a paradox around working with cultural differences, and I wonder what your point of view is. On the one hand, it's so important and so valuable to be aware of differences in preferences and style and cultural background so we can adapt. On the other hand, I believe it's also important not to, I'm going to say, dumb down or hold back on what is effective out of a cultural sensitivity, but rather to adapt to what is effective so it actually works. So a simple example is, if you're in a culture where people don't like to speak up publicly, you put them into pairs and have them talk to each other and report out. If people don't like to criticize, you say, let's take a moment and everybody, please come up with what you see as the advantages and the disadvantages, or what would a reasonable critic say about this if you're talking to others. So you find all kinds of ways to adapt to, but not avoid what might be culturally difficult. And I'd love your comments on that.
I can comment. Thank you, Steve. That's obviously a very important issue, and I applaud you for saying what you did say. I think it's very important that we not, of course, obviously not dumb down, but that we do adapt. And your example was great. The strategies that you use, I think, work well. This comes up a lot, I feel, with clients from cultures, that are more sort of what I would call more intellectually normed. I'm talking about my own culture, German culture, for instance, where, we have the highest number of CEOs with PhDs and intellectual power. It goes over everything, and there's a lot of tendency to kind of go into abstract concepts and models. And then we talk about coaching, we talk about developing, it has to happen on a personal level. It has to happen with personal sharing sometimes, and getting away from the abstract to more of the concrete behaviors that we actually display. And so what are ways that I can apply as a coach, as German leader or German client, that makes them comfortable enough to actually go into this place? And I can share my own story, I can share my own journey, I can ask questions in a way that open up those kinds of maybe hitherto hidden areas of thought. But for the benefit of the coaching process, I have to somehow be able to unlock that part of their story, right? To be able to coach them effectively. So I think adapting is of utmost importance. And so thank you for bringing up that topic. So we have to get them into discovering who they really are in a very personal way. And so even from the definition, if I see at the end it says, to maximize their personal and professional potential, in many cultures, that word personal would not even show up as part of your work life. But of course, in a coaching relationship, that is where it's at, right? So we have to find ways to unlock that part. Thanks for the question.
No, and I would agree.
Okay.
And obviously, that's where coaching in many countries is still seen as a form of therapy. That not only will organizations not pay for it, but they also, individuals, would not want to be seen to being coached because it will be seen maybe as a sign of weakness, that there's something wrong, that, be corrective rather than developmental, etc. So that's where, again, even the definition of coaching, the word can have very culturally loaded meaning.
So we're going to move towards the end of our time together. We want to respect your schedules culturally and in other ways. Jeremy, if you want to, we're going to share some resources. These are all going to be on the CoachSource Connect platform for you to download the slides. So we're going to upload them after this seminar. And Patty, thank you for doing that. So here's some things that you can look for, articles on coaching specifically, but also more general cultural resources that we find very useful. And then to close with some of our tips and considerations for you to keep in mind. Here's one that Jeremy uses a lot.
Mm-hmm. This is from our colleague Lilian Tsai, who is Malaysian, and she shares with us this Chinese word ting, which means to listen. And it's just, again, going back to Steve's point, it's not changing everything with the way we do it, it's adapting, expanding, if you like, looking at things from many different perspectives. So what I love about this term is that, like many Chinese characters, they have many different elements to it. So if you start top left there, listen with the ears, that's what we normally think about in terms of listening, but also listening with the mind, trying to work out, particularly if you're in an individual coaching situation, not just what is being said, but what is being meant, and then what is not being said. So looking at those meta messages. So we're really trying to analyze what's going on as we're talking to the coachee, reviewing our notes between meetings, etc. Listening with our eyes. So if we have the chance to do one-on-one or by video cam, then, we're looking at the coachee and really trying to gauge in terms of where they are, in terms of how they're looking, do they look comfortable, uncomfortable, but again, not make assumptions, because, for example, eye contact in some cultures, that's a sign of, interest, focus, reliability. In other cultures, by not keeping eye contact, it's the opposite thing. That's the way you show respect. A oneness and focus on the other person instead of thinking about the next cute question to ask, which sometimes we do, myself included. We really focus on what the client, what the coachee is saying, what they're not saying, etc. Listen with the heart, what emotions are being expressed. And this gets to the who of coaching again. What's going on again, without going into therapy and counseling, but at the same time, so that we can bring up Rita's point, we can empathize with where they are, even though we're not going to solve certain issues they may have, but it may be impacting their work, obviously, if it's in a work environment. And the last thing, just treating the other person as a king or queen. So just expanding this idea of listening. We talk about active listening. This is holistic listening.
Mm-hmm. Nice. And then we're leaving you with a small list of tips and reminders that we find helpful, from self-awareness, anticipation, preparation, and so forth. What I want to emphasize is that with clients from different cultural backgrounds, you have to invest more time in explaining your philosophy and your approach and the process, and not assume that, it's all understood the same way that you're explaining it to people from, similar cultural backgrounds. So it might just take more time to explain what coaching means to you and what different roles are, so the expectations are clearer. And then, of course, we're ending with the platinum rule, which we know beats the golden rule. Do unto others as they like to be done unto them. And so they are the starting point. Your client is to whom you adapt. And that's the way that's probably going to get you the most success in your coaching endeavors. So we want to thank you very much for your time and your interest and your great questions. And if you wanted to raise any further questions or just send us a note, here's our email addresses. And again, thank you, Patty, for being a great producer and host. And we wish you all a good day together. For the rest of the day, or good evening. And thanks for joining us from around the world.
Thank you.
Bye for now. And if any of you are attending the CoachSource conference in New York, beginning of November, we'll both be there, and we're very happy to continue this conversation.
Have a great day or evening, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
Bye.